Every axe needs a sheath or a mask. And in this video I'm gonna show you how to make one yourself and customize it to your preferences. My name is Ola and this is my channel, My Outdoor Ways. But today we are indoors in my leather workshop. And I'm gonna show you how to make an axe mask or axe sheath and customize it to your liking. I put some of my axes on the table here. I thought we could take a look at them first. As I laid out these 4 axes now, they can be divided into 2 main categories as far as the sheath or the mask is considered. These 2 are locked on the axe head with a strap that goes around the handle underneath the pole and locks onto the sheath itself. And these 2 consist of sheaths that wrap around the blade. I'm gonna explain the difference between these 2 types of sheaths. As it happens, I only brought Swedish axes to the table today. I have a few Italian Rinaldi axes that you may have seen in previous videos that I like and use a lot. But today I only have Swedes here, which isn't such a bad thing when it comes to axes anyway, right? 2 types of sheaths basically. First, there's the wraparound sheath, as I have on this Säter axe. I think it's a Säter anyway, I haven't seen any stamps on it, but I'm pretty sure it's a Säter. Could be a Hultsbruk, but I don't know. Anyway, this is easy to make. And if you have an axe blade that's significantly wider at the edge than it is a bit back up on the cheek, then you can make a wraparound sheath that sits very securely on the axe head, because it's much narrower here than down here, so it can't slip off. And I like to use ball post studs to lock them. That is a really great thing, I think. Locks easily, opens easily, easy to mount. And I stitch all my sheaths along the edge, put rivets, give them some extra strength. Sometimes I put 2 rows of stitches, usually enough with 1 I think. And there is of course a welt in between. If you make a leather sheet with just a piece of leather wrapped around and stitch that together, the edge of the blade will cut the seam, so you have to have a 3rd layer of leather in between here, and that's called a welt. And you make that so it goes a bit up against the edge on the inside of the sheath, so the edge has some leather to bite into, so it can't reach the stitching. If you don't do that, your sheaths will fail. If you just put them together with rivets, like the sheath on my Gränsfors Bruk hewing axe, and you don't have a welt between here, then the edge will come in contact with the rivets and you will destroy the edge. Or actually, if you drop it really badly, you can actually cut the rivets, because these rivets aren't that strong. I don't really like this sheath. They made it at the factory. It should pass a bit further up the cheek, so it can be narrower up here and sit tighter to the blade, because the fit isn't really that good. It can actually come off without opening the locking button. So I will probably replace this eventually, but I'll just leave it as this for now. But it's the same type of sheath basically. Then we have these types of sheaths with straps, and if you are not comfortable putting a wraparound sheath on your axe, you can put a strap on it that passes around the handle underneath the pole of the axe, and that secures it really tightly to the axe. This is my Beveling's carpentry axe. I use that for work sometimes actually. That's also held together with a ball post stud. On this particular one I put the stud on the strap and have a secondary short strap from the sheath that goes back and snaps onto that. Just a variation. A simpler way to do it is like I did on this. This is my largest felling axe that I use now. I think it's a Hultsbruk that has no visible stamps either, but just based on how many axes Hultsbruk actually produced, I think it is one of those. Here the strap just goes all the way around the sheath, and I put the stud on the sheath itself. It's a bit easier to make. Works just as well. And here is another carpenter's axe. That is a slightly newer Hultsbruk, and that's the one I will make a sheath for. in this video. I just renovated it, took away the rust, sharpened it a bit, oiled the handle. I'll probably sell it later on, but that's another story. I will make this sheath a little bit special. I will customize it, some extra stuff that I didn't do on my other sheaths. So stay tuned and see what that's all about. Maybe you'll learn something interesting today. First things first, we're gonna make a template. First, you trace the axe with some sort of permanent marker. There we have it. Onto this you can sketch your design with a pencil, so you can erase and do it again if you're not happy. There are a few things that are important. First of all, when you make a sheath that's held with a strap, the length of the edge has to be the same where the sheath ends. Ugly box shaped sheath like that, just to exemplify. You have to take this measurement and transfer it to this end of the sheath. So this back piece can pass over the widest part of the blade when you pull it off. When you make a wraparound sheath, you don't have to worry about that. Then you want it to fit snugly and taper along with the shape of the blade. But since I'm not making a wraparound sheath now, but a strap sheath, I will have to take that into consideration. Secondly, the width of the welt. If you're happy with just one row of stitching, like on the ones I showed you, it doesn't have to be that wide. But on this one I will make 2 rows of stitching. I think 15 millimeters is a good width then. Gives me plenty of space to put 2 rows of stitching furthest out, and leave a bit of leather inside of that for the axe edge to bite into without cutting the first seam. And you also have to make it down here, so the sharp corner of the axe head won't cut the seam down here when you pull it out. And I need to sketch a basic design first, so I know where it ends down here. Up here I know where I want it to go. I want to stop just before the eye, so I will go here somewhere. I can make an S shape down like that if I think that looks good. It gives me a point here where I have to transfer that measurement. I don't want to make it like that this time. I want it slightly larger. So I want to follow this line and try to cover the cheek entirely. That gives me something like that. You can always play around with this and sketch until you find a design that you like. And I'll take this measurement again, transfer it down to here. Gives me a point here. And then I can let the welt run along that corner and the bottom edge. You don't have to be too bothered with how I design this. As I said, this is where you create what you think look good. This is about your preferences, not mine. You can't just cut this piece of paper and fold it over and copy it now, because then you don't take into account the thickness of the blade of the axe. So you have to raise it up and mark the thickness of the blade furthest back of where your sheath template ends. Divide that little measurement, put a mark there, put a line out to not the toe of the blade, but rather the toe of the template for the sheath. Strike a line, and that's where you fold the paper. Probably put ball post stud here later, and the rivet on the other side where the strap connects to the sheath. You have to pay attention to, when you do that, what side of the axe you think will face outwards when you hang it on the wall or whatever you do with it. I can now cut the template all the way up to where my line starts. Then I fold it along the line. You can just put the ruler down, fold it over that. If you have a good quality thumbnail, you can run that along the line to make an imprint, then it's very easy to fold it. If you don't have a good thumbnail, you can use something else. Just trace along that and cut that half as well. And there's the template. Time to bring out some leather. This is around 3 millimeters thick. It's the same thickness you use when you make belts. not that important as long as it's not too thin. It has to have some sort of thickness and sturdiness to it to make a decent sheath. 3mm is a bit over the top perhaps. You can go slightly thinner, like 2, 1.8. Definitely shouldn't go thicker, I think, at least. Anyway, this is what I'm gonna use, because this is undyed, vegetably tanned leather. I have other qualities as well that I use. For these sheaths you can see it's clearly dyed to a nice reddish brown color. It's not quite as thick as this either, but for the special decoration I'm gonna do on this sheath, I need the leather to be undyed and vegetably tanned. I'm using the template to mark where to cut on the leather without creating a lot of waste unnecessarily. Before you start marking on your piece of leather, you have to be aware of what side of the template is facing out and what's facing in, but on this particular template it doesn't matter since it's totally symmetrical. And I like to mark on the nice side that will face out, which is the grain side, apart from the back side that is referred to as the flesh side. You can do that, of course. Here you can use a pen of some sort. The advantage is that you can spot all marks and things you don't want in your cutout piece. But I don't mark with a pen when I do that. I use a scratch awl instead. And just following the edge of the template. This is really not in any way any form of rocket science. There we have it. And now we cut it with a utility knife, if that's what you have. That's what I have, and that's actually what I prefer. I've had a few specialized knives for shoe making and saddle making, but I always come back to the utility knives because I think they are so easy to work with. You don't have to sharpen them, you just break the tip off the blade when it's dull or change the entire blade. Simple as that. Now it's time to cut out the welt. If you're not gonna make more sheaths from the same template, you can just cut the template, otherwise you have to copy this onto a separate piece of paper. Cut along the center line first and then just follow the line like that. And since the leather is thicker than the paper, when you put the welt in place and fold it, it will be too tight in here. The welt will want to stick out here a bit, so you have to cut away slightly on the side of the welt that's facing in towards the fold. I'm taking off, well, about as much as the leather thickness itself, which is 3mm, 1/16 of an inch perhaps. Try to cut it out on your piece of leather where you have the least amount of waste. The leather workshop is right underneath our kitchen, and our 1-year-old son Samson is dragging something along the floor up there. That's why you hear the rattling noise. We just have to live with that. And there you go. There's the piece of welt cut out. Now you have to prepare the grain side for gluing, and that's nice and flat and smooth now, so glue won't stick to it. So use something like this. And if you don't have one of these, you can use some sort of coarse sandpaper as well. Just scratch the surface, preferably without scratching your fingertips, which is a lot easier to do with this tool than you might imagine. There you go, now it's rough and nice. And now it will glue nicely inside of the sheath. That won't happen until later, because now it's time to do something extra to this. I'm gonna make this sheath look a little nicer by embossing a design onto it. And now it becomes important again to keep track of which side of the axe sheath will face out when you hang it on the wall or wear it or whatever. And I have decided this side, the right hand side, will be the display side. So that's where I'm gonna put my design. And there are lots of tools for embossing designs on leather. I have a few, but for this probably only gonna need these two. We'll see, maybe I'll use a couple of punches as well just to show how to do it. Oh, of course, I need the swivel knife. This will all become clear in a minute if you are not already familiar with this type of work. Small rawhide mallet. This is extra small. I usually use this size, which is probably more commonly available. This is extra small and extra neat when you do small intricate things. Perhaps I can use them both. Just put them there. And we need a bowl of water. And we need the picture of the design, which is the Hultsbruk logotype that I found on the internet. Ordinary tap water and a washing up sponge. You can use whatever you want to transfer the water. A rag, your finger even. Just something that's clean. It transfers the water satisfactory. You don't need to do much of soaking now when you only transfer the design to the leather. Just a little bit so the surface gets a bit damp. Let it sink in. If there are spots where it sinks, slowly help it, wipe it a little bit. When the surface has no pools of water anymore, it feels damp but not wet, you can put your paper with your design on top of it. I'm putting it right in the middle. To transfer it, I'm gonna use a tool that has a polished ball-shaped tip. If you don't have that, you can use whatever you can find. A nicely blunted pencil tip would work. Something from the kitchen drawers. Anyway, just trace the picture. You don't have to push that hard. The imprints are very easy to make when the grain side is nice and moist. Now that I've traced the design, I'm cutting the lines with a swivel knife. You don't have to use a swivel knife to make embossings, but it looks a lot better when you cut the lines before you emboss them. And the swivel knife makes a shallow but wide cut, which is something that is desirable when you do leather embossings. You don't want to cut too deep in the leather. You want to widen the cut a little bit so you can get in there with the tools. Punch down the background without punching the relief parts. Now it's important not to let the leather dry out too much. since the design is imprinted and cut with a swivel knife, you can add quite a lot of more water to the leather. There are different schools concerning this. Some think it should be thoroughly soaked all the way through and left in a plastic bag in the fridge overnight. That's mostly for making knife sheaths, I think. When embossing this type of leather, you don't really need to do that. Just get it thoroughly watered down. Do some test runs and get a feel for the material, and you will know how much water you will need to add. Now I'm gonna use this pouting tool. It's a spoon-shaped little thing, and it has sort of a blade on this end. The one I traced with before is more or less the same type of tool. It has a spoon in one end and a ball point on the other. I have no use for the ball point now after tracing, so I'm switching to this that has the spoon end and blade. And I'm gonna follow the contour of everything I cut now in the design and press the background down a bit. I think I will use a background punch to this as well. That adds certain texture to the leather, onto which the dye I will use sticks better, and the design comes out and pops better with more contrast to the background than otherwise. But I'm starting with following everything here, pressing it down a bit. The leather should feel a little bit like clay or plastilene. Then you know you have the right amount of water in it. When you press it down, it shouldn't come back up. It should stay down, and it shouldn't be too hard pressing it down. It should be fairly easy, just like it was clay that you were working on. And if you're doing a big design that takes a lot of time, you have to constantly add water with a sponge or a rag. But in the end it's not especially complicated. It just takes a bit of practice and patience. And my definite recommendation is to make a fairly large and simplified design first times you try it out. And by large, I don't necessarily mean a large picture like back piece for a vest or something, but large simple shapes in the design, not too much detail and intricate tight lines and shapes. There are lots of different punches for leather embossing. Some are background punches as the ones I'm trying to find now, some are shading punches, some make parts of floral patterns or whatever. But what I'm looking for now is textured background punches, and also a circular punch that I will use for a specific part of this design. I think they are designed to be used in floral designs, quite popular in the Western cowboy culture. I've never done any of those designs myself, but I use some of the punches for other things. Anyway, starting with the largest one. If the moisture level on the leather is just right, you really don't need a lot of force at all for this. Now I want to punch down the spaces between all these perimeter short lines. I have a smaller background punch that I can get into. Do that. I think that's all of them. I have to touch up a bit with the first one again. It's already taken shape. Now I'm gonna do the letters and the arrow in the middle. And that's where I need this little circular flower seed punch, because there's a circular indent in the middle down there. So I'm putting it there and tapping it once, and that's it. I'm doing some final touch up with the spoon shaped tool, but this is basically it, really. This is how you emboss leather, or at least it's the way I emboss leather. And there it is, the Hultsbruk logotype. And now this has to dry before I dye it, so I will leave this until tomorrow and come back to it. It's the second day in my leather workshop, and the embossing I did yesterday has dried up nicely now. But before I can dye the workpiece, I'm actually gonna do some more embossing that I didn't think about yesterday, because I suddenly remembered I have these embossing rollers that I think are pretty nice. I'm gonna swap the one I have on the handle now for this one, because I think that will look better on the sheath. I don't need to soak the leather that much to put the pattern on there, but I think it would look nice to have some sort of pattern along the edge. And that's gonna run here, where the sheath is not stitched together as it is here. And before I use the roller, I have to bevel the edge, because now it's just very roughly cut. So I'm gonna use an edge beveler. These come in various sizes, they cut away different amounts of material. So each of them are suitable for different leather thicknesses. I have number 1, 2 and 3 here. Number 2 that I have in my hand is usually the one I go for when it's this type of thickness, 2-3 millimeters. There's really not that much to this, but if you're gonna bevel both sides of the leather, you start with the flesh side. Then you turn it around and do the grain side. It only cuts to a certain depth, so there is no risk of taking off too much material with them. And now I'll soak the workpiece very gently with water again. But as I said earlier, I have to put it on the whole piece to avoid ugly borders between wet and dry leather. But I don't put a lot at all on the part of the leather that will not be embossed again. Just to even out the transitions. I'm going to swap the roller for the one I want to use. Just a little bit of extra. I think it's a nice touch. This won't take long to dry. So while I wait, I'm gonna prepare the strap. I'm gonna use this strap cutter. It's a very good tool if you are working with leather. Every time you want to cut a strap, it's really good to have one of those. I'm gonna cut it from the same piece of leather. Anything else would just be silly, right? I'm going to estimate how long the strap has to be. 5 inches there, so I'm gonna make it 10 as a total, about 25 centimeters. I already have a straight edge to cut straps from, and this is long enough and then some. This is set to 16 millimeters. From last time I think I made a similar thing, which is 5/8 of an inch. So there's nothing to it really. I can just go ahead and cut myself a strap right away. And that's it. And I'm also gonna shape the end on one side, where I'm gonna fasten it to the sheath. The other side I have to cut to length first before I shape that end. One of the most convenient tools to use to round off the edge of the strap, I think, is a woodworking gouge, a carving tool. I use them a lot in the leather workshop. To save a bit of time while I wait for the leather to dry again, I'm gonna glue the sheath up and stitch it. And it's debatable whether you should dye the leather before you stitch it up or not. It depends a little bit on what sort of dye you are using, and the dye I am using, it actually makes more sense to use it after you've done the stitching than before. I'm gonna glue the welt in place and make the seams. I've spoken about glue spreaders in previous videos. My opinion on them is they are not worth buying. I don't use them. I just use small leftovers from other leather projects. I cut it to a bevel on one side so it's easy to spread the contact cement with it, and that works great, I think. Buying special glue spreaders is just a waste of money. You really don't need them. If you haven't used contact cement before, it works like this. You spread the glue on both surfaces that are going to be glued together. Wait for it to soak into the material and dry a bit. Then, if you are really thorough, you put on another coat. It soaks up pretty quickly into this leather. Actually, I can already put the second coating on. You don't need as much on the second one as on the first one, as the first one acts as a primer and seals all the pores if you are gluing porous materials. It's really not that complicated. Just put it on there, give it a little bit of time to dry up. Opening times vary from different brands of glue, of course. And then you get your pieces together and give them a good smack. I happen to have a cobbler's hammer, which is really handy for this type of work. You can use whatever hammer you have handy. Strictly speaking, Maybe you don't have to glue this at all, but I like to keep the parts in place when I stitch them. It also makes the outer edge that's visible a bit nicer, because it's not just held together with the stitching, it's also held together with glue, and that makes it tight all the way out to the edge where you can see it. Also prevents water and dirt to get in between the layers of leather. I suppose it's not that big of a deal, but I mainly like that it looks better in the end. Blowing on it helps it to dry up. I haven't beveled this edge yet, as you may have spotted. That's because I want to stitch it first. Then I'm gonna trim the edge and bevel it and polish it a bit. So I haven't forgot about it. You just do it later. Now it's ready for stitching. The first thing I want to do before starting the stitching is to mark out where the two rows will be. And then it's very useful to keep the template for the welt. I have marked 2 lines on it where I want to put the rows. One of them is a little bit further into the material than the center of the welt. That gives me quite a lot of material to keep the axe edge from contacting the stitching. It's about 7 millimeters, a quarter of an inch. And that's sufficient. And I'm marking on the same side as I did the embossing. It's best to have the stitching as straight as possible on the nice side, I think. And I use that ballpoint thing I used when I transferred the pattern before. And just follow the line and press down into the leather. And then the second line for the outer row of stitches. I put that about 3 millimeters from the edge, perhaps. I think that's about 1/16 of an inch, perhaps. And there I have some very discreet markings on where to put the holes for the stitches. That's totally sufficient for me. And I will not run the stitches all the way out to the edge here, because there I want to put the rivet instead. Now I'm going to use copper rivets and washers. I think that's nice. I usually don't do that on my simpler sheaths, but this one's a bit special, so I'm gonna use those types of rivets here. I use waxed linen thread for the seam, and I have some tools, small pair of scissors, and all with a cutting blade. It's a double-edged type of blade. I also have an awl with a round tip, which is not for cutting the holes, but for widening them when I do the back stitching to fasten the seam. Pair of pliers, handy to pull the saddler's needles through the holes when they get tight. And saddler's needles themselves, they come in different sizes. You have to match them to the type of thread you are using. I'm estimating how much thread I need, plus a little extra so I have something to pull in when I tighten the seam. You will learn by experience how much you need for every sort of stitching you do. It depends on how thick the material is and how long the seam is, and how you space the holes for your stitches as well. And it's always a good thing to have a little bit extra, so you don't end up with too little when you have like 1 or 2 stitches left. Pull it through about the same length in both needles. And now we're gonna do a saddler's stitch for this, or a shoemaker's stitch. I think it depends on if it's a saddle maker or a shoemaker that speaks about it, really. That's when you use 2 needles. I really don't think you can do this in a good way without some sort of stitching clamp. I have several. You can find them in the stores that sell equipment for leather work. Anyway, I'm using the cutting awl now. to start making holes. I'm doing the inside seam first. You develop your own method for this. And I find to get a good hole where your needles won't jam, after you put the double-edged awl tip through the leather, you twist it 90 degrees and pull it out. That widens the holes. It's a lot easier to get the needles through. My spacing is about 6 to 8 millimeters, which means somewhere around 1/4 of an inch. And I like to do 4 or 5 holes at a time before I start stitching. Grab your thread with the 2 saddler's needles. Now the basic principle is that you start in the first hole on the middle of the thread. You put the first needle in from one side, and then you put the second needle from the other side in the same hole, and there you have your first stitch. But I usually do it in a slightly different way, which I think is a lot better. I start in the second hole and not the first. I still find the middle of the thread, which you do by placing the needles together and just pull up. Then I go back to the first hole. Because now I have the means to pull the first stitch tight, giving me a better starting point for the rest of the seam. And what I also do is I make lock stitches on every stitch. And that is done by putting the first needle through with my right hand. I don't pull all the thread through, I save a little loop. Then I put the other needle from the other side through the same hole. Push it through halfway, I stop there. Now I pull my loop of linen thread back to ensure I haven't put the needle through the thread. When I can see that it runs freely, I twist it 2 times clockwise around the needle. Then I pull it out and pull back the slack and tighten the stitch. And that gives me a lock stitch with a little knot inside of the leather. Now I repeat that on all my stitches. And it's important to twist the thread in the same direction every time. The result of that is that every stitch is placed slightly diagonal, which gives you a very nice and even and good looking seam in the end. If you don't do that, the stitches will steer off a little bit to the sides, to the left and right. But doing like this, not only do you get a stronger seam, because if the thread breaks, the stitches won't rip as easily since there are locking knots inside of every one of them. But you also get good looking stitches that stand diagonally in the same direction. Strangely enough, they don't teach this at all the saddler schools. Can't imagine why, really. Because they do a lot of hand stitching. So if you're gonna do that, why not do it the nicest way possible? You can develop a bit of speed for this technique. It's not very hard to learn, really. From doing this so many years, my pinky and ring finger automatically catch the loop. I don't even have to think about it, really. It just happens because I'm used to it. I use a special technique when I catch the first needle on the other side. I put it through the hole. I have my other needle resting on my index finger and long finger. I catch the first needle from underneath and put my thumb over it so I pinch it. I pull it out. Then I twist like that. So my other needle goes back through the hole. That's also something you learn very quickly. That happens almost automatically once you have gotten it into your habit. Now I have to check where the rivet will sit so I don't continue too far down here with the stitching. And here's a little rivet. That's gonna sit just on the edge here. I can just hold it like that and mark with the tip of the awl right next to it on both lines so I know where to put my last stitching holes. And make them first. So I can get even spacing between the holes. At this point I could just jump over to the outer line and do that seam as well, but I want to fasten this and start over with a new thread. And when you fasten a seam like this, you don't make knots, you do back stitches in the same holes instead. Around 3 is usually enough. And that's where the awl with a round tip comes into play. I want to widen the holes I'm gonna stitch back through. If I would try to do that with the double-edged cutting awl, I would risk cutting the thread. So I'm using the round tip, entering and widening the hole. And then it's a lot easier to get the needles through one more time now that the hole is stuffed with linen thread. It's not always necessary. Sometimes I can do it without using the round tip, but it's good to have it if the holes are too tight. It's exactly the same type of stitch going backwards. I do the lock stitches there as well. Nothing particular about it whatsoever. And if it is too tight in the hole, then you use your pliers and pull your needle through with them. There we go. 3 back stitches, cutting the thread as close to the work as possible. And that's the first seam out of 2. Now for the second one. I have demonstrated this technique in a couple of other videos. One of them is when I made 3 different types of sheaths for access and also a sling in the end. If you want to have some more instructions on this saddler's stitch, you could go back and watch that. And on my other channel, My Able Ways, I did a video series when I made a knife sheath. Perhaps that's the most thorough documentation I've done on this type of stitching. So you can go back and watch those if you want to. But most importantly, if you're interested in this, just try it out for yourself and see how you like it. I remember for myself it was quite an eye-opener when I learned to make this lock stitch. That improved my stitching very much. I was astounded by how easy it was to learn it. Nowadays I'm just astounded that the schools don't teach it at all. Perhaps there are schools that do, but the saddlers schools here in Sweden, the ones I have been to looking at, they didn't teach it there. Anyway, I'm gonna finish this second seam and then I'm gonna trim the edge and bevel and polish it. After that I think it's time to dye the leather. Looking pretty good so far, I think. So now I'm gonna use the edge beveler again. But first I'm gonna trim the edge a bit, because the welt sticks up a little bit here in the middle, as you can probably see. You should plan out for those things when you prepare your work, so you have a little bit extra to trim off. I don't think I need to take that much off really. Just a little bit. Something like that. I used the same size as before, number 2. I could probably use number 3 here, take off a little bit more, but the stitching is a bit close to the edge, so I don't want to cut too deep. So number 2 I think will be sufficient. There we go. And now it's a good time to polish the edge, if you want to do that. That's always nice. There are basically 2 types of polishing or burnishing. Well, where burnishing is the type of technique where you use friction heat to shape the edge. The other one is to use water, and I prefer that one. So back to the trusty water bowl. Just put some on with my finger. And then I usually just use the tool handle for these, because it has a nice curve here which fits pretty well over the edge. And I rub it a little bit like this. You can make a special tool for it if you want to. There are special tools to buy, of course. But the more you can make yourself, the more self-sufficient you are, and it's not really complicated. That's about it, really. It has a little bit of shine to it now. It's a little bit rounded over, nice and smooth. I'm happy with that. Not difficult at all, you just have to know that you should do it. So now it's time to dye the sheath, as well as the strap. I'm gonna use an antique finish for this. It doesn't sink into the leather as regular leather dye does. It sits more on the surface, and you polish it off slightly. So the deep parts of the embossed pattern will be darker, and the high parts, the relief parts, they will be lighter. And I think that's a nice effect. You put on quite a lot and try to distribute it as evenly as possible. Let it dry a little bit, and then you polish it off with a damp cloth or rag or something. You could also wear rubber gloves for this, which I forgot to put on. It's my mistake, I have to live with it. It's a little bit like ketchup. You have to be pretty quick to put it on, so you don't get any strange borderlines between wet and dry areas, just like when you soak the leather in water, or a little bit like that at least. Where the stitching holes are, it's good to work it down a little bit there, or so my experience tells me. Same thing with the embossed patterns. There we go. I'm gonna leave that to dry slightly, and I'm gonna do the strap, putting the dye on both sides of that. This doesn't have any embossed patterns or anything to enhance, but I still want it to have the same color. And even if you don't emboss the leather, the antique finish creates a nice patina, or it mimics a patina. The stuff looks old and worn a little bit already, although it's new. You really don't want to use a lot of water for this. Rub most of it off before you start to polish the dye. It dries pretty quickly, so you can't leave it for too long. And if it's too much water in the rag, you will polish off too much of the dye. And it's really hard to get it to look nice after that. Yeah, well, that's the strap. Now for the sheath itself. There you can see the embossing from the press roll I was using. Comes out quite a lot now with this dye. Nice, isn't it? Something's happened there. I'm not sure if I put a dab of glue there accidentally, or if it's a little bit of leather grease or something. That's too bad. I'm gonna see if I can rub it down and put on some more dye. I'm gonna try a little bit with sandpaper really carefully. Yeah, well, it's better. It will have to do. It's a bit of a shame, but accidents happen. The embossed pattern looks really nice, I think. So now this will be left to dry up slightly. The dye has dried, and now I'm gonna put some leather grease on it to seal it a bit. You could also put some top coat on it if you have that, I guess. You can use a little bit of what you have for leather maintenance. I don't think you really need a top coat. I know some people like to use top coat, but I've always just used leather grease. I found that to work pretty well. I guess you can't polish this greased surface, but I'm not really that fond of polished leather. I like sort of a matte finish anyway. Doesn't look too shabby, does it? And a little bit for the strap, which I haven't cut to length yet, but I will do that after I rivet it to the sheath. First I'm gonna put the rivet down here, where the stitching ends. Punching a hole with a 3mm round punch. Just checking with the rivet where to put it. That looks good. This one is a bit too short. Yeah, that's the one I'm using for the strap. I have another one here that's a bit longer. And that protrudes a bit. On goes the washer, which is a bit tight. We'll take care of that. Punch set for riveting. 2, 3 and 4mm. I think 3mm is actually too small. I'm gonna have to use the 4mm punch, and this has a hole in it where the rivet is supposed to enter when you compress the materials. Now it sticks out a little bit too much for my liking, so I'm snipping off some of it. Ball peen hammer, that's what you need. I've seen worse rivets than that. Now it's time to mount the strap. So I'm punching a hole in the end of it, the one that I rounded off nicely before. And then I'm gonna punch a hole in the sheath. Just gonna put the axe inside of it so I am certain I'm putting it in the right location. Marking with a scratch awl, like so. Boink. Hole. That one doesn't protrude as much, so I can just hammer it down without cutting it. Nice. Time for the ball post stud. I have them in different colors. I'm gonna use this nice antique brass colored one for this. And this one screws into place. Somewhere I had a screwdriver. Yeah, here it is. To keep it in place, you could put some thread lock on it. I don't have thread lock, but I have super glue, so I'm using that on the threads. Time to cut the strap to length and punch a hole in it for the ball post stud so the strap can lock. Fitting it onto the axe, just put a little mark right where the ball post stud is, and I will cut it like here. Can make a mark there as well, right on the mark. But it's not enough with just a hole, it has to be slit, otherwise it can't pass over the ball. You can do it with a utility knife, but I have this straight chisel that's really handy for these types of things. Using that. The gouge I used before. That should work. It's a bit tight when it's new. Yeah, there we go. Locks into place nicely. Let's see how it looks on the axe then, shall we? Not too bad, if I may say so myself. I really hope I find someone who wants to take it off my hands. It would be a real shame if it just ended up as a wall hanger in my workshop. Anyway, there you have it. I hope you found it amusing and interesting and instructive to watch this video. And I do hope you try making some leather embossing yourself if you haven't already done that. If you have so, tell me about it in the comments. And on your way out, don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you want to help me grow the channel and make more content. Anyway, until next time, take care of yourselves, and I see you later.